Please welcome to the stage Arthur Brooks, president of the American Enterprise Institute and the Aspen Institute's Eric Liu.
Good morning, everybody. Well, this is a really conversation I've been looking forward to for some time. Those of you from this Washington know Arthur Brooks as the president of the American Enterprise Institute, best-selling author, most recently of The Conservative Heart, and New York Times columnist, contributor. But those of us from the other Washington know him as a Seattle kid made good, who is doing interesting things in the world. And Arthur, I actually want to start, not to be too parochial, but we were talking a little bit early about how a city like Seattle, which today is monochromatically progressive, may not be able to have the full breadth of ideas and options when it comes to reckoning with inequality that some other places in the country are. And I'd like to draw you out on that a little bit, because we are the city that pioneered the $15 minimum wage. And just your thoughts on kind of political monocultures and how we deal with inequality.
Well, to begin with, thank you. What an honor to be here. I've been looking forward to this too. And thank you to all of you for sticking around for this session. When you say that people know me in Seattle as a Seattle boy who made good, becoming the president of the American Enterprise Institute, by Seattle standards, is not making good. So I want to disabuse our audience of that notion entirely. And Seattle has become really a political monoculture, and a lot of places have around the United States. This is a phenomenon that we see every place, and the flare-ups that we see on college campuses to a large extent. I mean, people are on different sides of these issues, and I'm not going to adjudicate that. But one of the key things that we see on college campuses, these are academic hothouse versions of Seattle, Washington, where there's kind of one point of view that's really dominant. Now, there are isolated pockets of different kinds of thinking, but one of the things that I would like all of us to regret is that in completely progressive or completely conservative enclaves, that people simply don't get the diversity of ideas that are fundamental to a free society. The founding motto of my own institution, the American Enterprise Institute, in the 1930s was that the competition of ideas is fundamental to a free society. And I think that we see this all over America. I mean, all of you probably join me in a lot of regret about the political polarization that we see. So let's talk about why that is and how we could kind of fix that, not just in Seattle, but in places, campuses, towns, cities, all over America. When you have a moral consensus about the American experiment, then differences of political ideas, they can radiate around that moral consensus in a competition of ideas, which is a really healthy thing. But when that moral consensus collapses, then, and I'm not trying to commit political science on you here right now, but then what happens when there's a lack of a moral consensus, when that craters, then political ideologies, and they hit each other head on and become a holy war. And that's what we see today. So one of the things that I'm trying to establish in my own work at AEI, and that me and my band of merry pranksters and friends at the American Enterprise Institute, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to reestablish this concept between left and right of the moral consensus of the American experiment, which is to establish, build opportunity, and push it all the way down to the people who need it the most. Then progressives and conservatives, they can approach that moral consensus from different angles, and it doesn't become a holy war. Then it is a competition of ideas, which is the fundamental basis, we believe, of what a free society is supposed to be built on.
I do want to get to the policy dimensions of that in a moment, but let's start with this moral consensus question, right? Because a lot of those of you who've read The Conservative Heart and some of the other work that you've done know that you've been coming at these questions in an interesting way that is about values and culture preceding markets and policy even, yeah. Right? And so what kind of moral consensus does there need to be about not just opportunity, but about notions of how we balance liberty and equality, for instance, right? I mean, once you start saying, well, we value liberty more than equality, or we value equality more than liberty, you don't have a moral consensus. You just have that same battle of ideas and say, either the minimum wage is good or it's evil, right. Because it's either impinging on liberty or it's, helping equality.
Right. And indeed, the real problem that we have is a third dimension of policy success, which is neither equality or let's say equity, fairness, or freedom, which is efficiency. I mean, to a very large extent, the collusion between right and left in our society has been toward ruthless efficiency. And when you're talking about efficiency all the time, then you can have kind of fringe arguments that seem fringe arguments about equality and freedom that are moving in orthogonal spaces, but with the pulsation that's objectifying people, that's creating materialism, that's kind of taking a lot of the life in life, is this brutal efficiency argument that's going on along the time. So let's get back to the fundamental premise of what you just asked, which is, what is the cultural basis that we should be establishing before we even get to the broad policy questions? There is, in the free enterprise movement, where I do most of my work at AEI, the canonical text, the book that everybody reads, the holy book, as it were, of the free enterprise movement, is The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, written in 1776. Very important year in the Scottish Enlightenment, the American Revolution. Obviously, this is an important year for ideas all around the globe. The Wealth of Nations talks about the way in which a society can organize itself along free enterprise as we'd understand it today, free enterprise, capitalistic lines, and people can become richer through the pursuance of their self-interest, the invisible hand, etc. We all know this. Now, here's the point that I want to make. Adam Smith himself was a professor of moral theology. There was no such thing as an economist in those days.
Those were the days.
The good old days. I mean, it's like, now, why is that important? Well, I'm an economist, but deep down it's my responsibility, I believe, to be thinking about moral theology, to be thinking along the same lines. Adam Smith did not write The Wealth of Nations first. It was not his first book, nor his best book. His most important book, according to him, was written 17 years earlier in 1759. It was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Adam Smith believed that a good society is based on principles that today we would understand as brotherhood and solidarity, that you have to have morals before you can effectively have markets. Adam Smith, I believe, based on my own reading of these texts, would think that our whole understanding or our whole conversation about whether markets are good or bad is completely misguided. That would be to say, are cars good or bad? Are machines good or bad? It depends. There's nothing inherently moral about your automobile. It depends on how you use it. A car can't be moral, only a person can. And it's an efficiency culture that takes humanity out of our everyday lives that would try to imbue a non-human thing with human morals. It's a misguided conversation. Morals first, then markets, and then we can have a productive conversation.
Let's imagine that you and I and the people in this room are able to actually, in the next few days, shift American culture, create that moral consensus that is around that theory of moral sentiments, notion of...
The Aspen Institute is an incredibly powerful institute.
We're just
that 2 days.
We're just that good.
Yeah, that's right.
So we create that kind of fabric of duty and obligation and brotherhood and so on and so forth. Okay, now, upon that moral foundation, one of the things that you're doing that's also interesting on the policy level is exploring where left and right might actually agree on remedies to the concentration of opportunity, the inequality that we face today. What can the left learn from the right now, and what can the right learn from the left on dealing with inequality? Well,
the answer is a lot on both sides. I grew up in a liberal democratic ecosystem, and now I work mostly within political conservatism. And I sort of regret that because the free enterprise movement exists on the political right. I would like to move that beyond politics. And so we agree that the free enterprise system is the best system for lifting people up all around the world by the billions, and having a system that's with proper regulation and based on human morality that would be able to do that. And so that's really my goal, is to have this not be political at all. But as we see politics today, what can the right learn from the left, and what can the left learn from the right? I would say that the left can learn from the right the sanctification of work. And this is something that a lot of people on the left really feel, but they have a tendency to not talk about it quite enough. And the other is this understanding that free enterprise at its root, which is not anarchic capitalism, which is free enterprise is a system of goals and morals and institutions within the context of morality and government that really sets people free, and in point of fact has lifted 2 billion people out of poverty. So I would say that the celebration of free enterprise and an understanding of the moral dignity that comes from all kinds of work are something that the right takes for granted and the left could as well. Now, going the other direction is something that I've thought an awful lot about. And one of the things that I admire the most about my friends on the left is the preference for the poor. This whole idea that the reason that you have privilege is so you can help more people who need your help. This is something that the left kind of gets naturally, that we tend to kind of forget on the political right sometimes. Why does abundance matter? Abundance is good. It's interesting. I just spent the last week with the Dalai Lama in his monastery in Dharamsala. He's become a real mentor, and we have a collaboration between our institutions. And it's a beautiful thing when I talk to him. And he reminded me, watch our website if you want to see the sessions that we did together. He reminded me that the 4 pillars of Tibetan Buddhism are enlightenment, spirituality, worldly satisfaction, and wealth. And I asked him, wealth? I mean, really? What does wealth mean? And he said, it is to have the resources to help people more. That's what wealth really is, right? I mean, look at all of you and us. We're really privileged, and we have a good education, and a lot of things are going right for us. Why does it matter? So that we can help people more. Who? The people who are not here and the people who are left behind. That innate sense I see a lot on the political left, and I want to bring it more to the political right. Second is an understanding of what the greatest achievements of the capitalist system are. And among the top 2 or 3 or 5 greatest achievements of the capitalist system that the left understands that the right needs to embrace is the safety net. I know it sounds nuts, right? But the reason that we have a safety net, that you're talking about the last session really eloquently, I thought, is that the safety net is instantiated. It's made possible for the first time in human history by the economic largesse that's made possible by capitalism. That gives us the space to not just be putting one foot in front of the other every day and getting to the end of the day economically, but to have more than we need and to be able to help people who are in need that we've never seen and we've never met. What a miracle. Now, the execution of the safety net is tricky, because making people dependent and not requiring work, et cetera, let's have all those arguments and conversations. But I want the right to declare peace on the safety net because it's one of the greatest achievements of the system, the economic system that we on the right cherish centrally to our philosophy.
So it's interesting. Several months ago, you had the pleasure of being on an onstage conversation with President Obama, E.J. Dionne, Bob Putnam, I believe. Mm-hmm. When the president brought up the idea of, closing the carried interest loophole or, raising capital gains taxes, your response, I'm paraphrasing roughly, was that those are side issues. That whatever you might want to do, those are side issues. That there's a core issue here you were defining as entitlement spending on the middle class. And so I guess one question I would pose here, if you're trying to persuade your fellow travelers on the right that the safety net not only matters but is in fact part and parcel of effective capitalism, square that with, okay, we need to trim, Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security or other parts of the entitlement bubble that you want to shrink.
Sure, and again, these are things easy for me to say because I run a think tank and I'm not a major threat to taking a seat in the United States Senate in Maryland, where I live. Barbara Mikulski's seat is going to be safe in Democratic hands, and certainly not in my hands. So, not having to run for office, I can say kind of whatever I think is right. And here basically is the conundrum that we face. As somebody who believes in the safety net, and somebody who wants good, robust defense spending, somebody who wants public services that work and that work well, what is the threat to that? Actually, let's talk more about what's the threat to the poor in America. Well, look at other countries that are further advanced in their development of social democracy and entitlement spending. Let's look at the periphery countries in Europe. And I don't want to torture the metaphor, but do look at what's going on in Greece right now. I mean, it's terrible. A 25% increase in suicide among the poor in Greece is what we've seen since 2010. Homelessness is up. Inadequate health care is up. Why? And the answer is austerity. Austerity is tyranny, right? And why is there austerity? And the answer is because there's insolvency. And why is there insolvency? It's because they haven't paid attention fiscally conservatively enough to what they're doing with their public spending. Sooner or later, you run out of money, is what it comes down to. And again, this is not the cult of efficiency. This is really a public policy agenda that has a preference for the poor. If you care about the poor, you must avoid austerity. To avoid austerity, you must take care of insolvency. Solvency depends on entitlement spending because that will gobble up always and everywhere all the money, which is what we've seen in the periphery economies. What's happening there will happen here if we don't keep our house in order. That doesn't mean trimming Medicare in the sense that let's just cut it back unilaterally. No, that means we need to reform it in a way that understands that we have a social contract with senior citizens in this country, with poor people in this country, that we're going to have a system that doesn't let people fall too far. The safety net, once again, is a good thing at all levels. But that means to keep it safe, we can't marginalize poor people and squeeze everything out of our economy. We have to be sensible about this and merciful about this and look down the road by 15 years.
So I want to give you a mirror image of the very interesting, your playbook is, it throws some people off because you will speak in a way that is about good conservative free enterprise principles, but using both language and beliefs that are going to be amenable to folks on the left. Coming the other direction, in an earlier session with Heather Boucher here, Heather is among a circle of people in this country who've been pioneering an idea called MiddleOut Economics, as something of an antidote to trickle-down economics. And in an interesting parallel way, the case that they're making for why we should, for instance, raise wages at the bottom, have a higher minimum wage, is not actually the case that you attribute to the left, which is you got to be compassionate toward the poor, you got to make sure they don't get left behind. They're actually making an interesting case, which is raising the wage this way is going to be great for business, because when workers have more money, businesses have more customers, and you set in motion this virtuous cycle of increasing demand. When you hear that, again, put aside the particulars of the minimum wage, but do you find that as interesting to hear folks on the left making a kind of great for business, great for the economy, great for growth argument for things that traditionally were in the category of compassion and niceness and fairness?
Yeah, I don't love it. And the reason I don't love it is because I think that bringing the left more toward the efficiency cult is not going to help. I think it's more important to bring the right toward the what we're trying to do as a our social mission of bringing everybody up from the very bottom. I think that's what we need to do. I disagree in a lot of ways with the economics of what happens when you increase the minimum wage and suddenly demand will filter through to the economy. I understand that certain parts of the economy will thrive, but I also know that you will get asymmetric growth. But here's the thing that really bothers me about that. And again, I'm not against the philosophy of trying to do things that stimulate demand endogenously. I think that's a good thing to do. But here's my big problem with that basic way of thinking. A minimum wage increase is objectively not a bad thing, because the objective of it is to help people work more and get paid more for work. I believe in work because I believe that work is the center of a dignified life that's full of meaning. I think it's a sanctified, ordinary thing that people deserve to be able to do. Every single one of us in here cherishes our work and non-market work as the center of meaning in our lives, as one of the centers of meaning in our lives. So I believe in that, and so I think that the minimum wage philosophy, is based on a really good objective. The problem is it's a messy policy. 82% of people on the minimum wage aren't poor, and the people who, at the very bottom, which is a minority of people, but a non-trivial minority of people who lose their jobs as a result of this, from industries that are right on the edge of profitability, those are disproportionately people who are the last into the workforce and have the most tenuous grasp on the workforce. In other words, the people we most want to help. So therefore, what I advocate, not just philosophically, not from the middle out, but from the bottom up, and certainly not from the top down, from the bottom up, is policies that make work pay, even if they cost money. So we talk about the earned income tax credit expansion. We talk about, people talk about a negative tax rate, wage subsidies, minimum basic wage that doesn't actually flow through the way that the minimum wage does. Guaranteed basic income, for example. A lot of conservatives and liberals could agree on some of these policies, and the president and I, in our panel at Georgetown University, we agreed, and if I were the Congress, we would actually have passed an expansion of the earned income tax credit for single men who have non-custodial care over kids. Why, right? I mean, let's just do that, and then we don't need the minimum wage. Sorry, all the applause stopped immediately, right? It's like, well, I hit the brakes on you there, didn't I? So, I love doing that. I mean, I never get invited to a second party. It's the weirdest thing.
Well, you'll get invited at least to a second debate on the minimum wage. But the last question, just on that, if you were the Congress, and let's all just imagine that for a minute. How nice that.
That's right.
Nice that would be.
That's right. It's easy to get to 60% when there's one guy, right? Yeah.
So. The program that I run at the Aspen Institute is on citizenship and American identity.
Yeah.
And the last question I want to pose to you is about the civic dimensions of the inequality that we're reckoning with in this country, right? The way that economic inequality begets political inequality, which begets more economic inequality, and you get fewer and fewer people able to call more and more of the shots, right? Does this feel to you like an area where AEI and CAP, right and left and other folks can start collaborating, which is just boosting civic voice and civic power, particularly of those in low-wage earners and low-income Americans? Again, later they can fight it out over whether they want right or left policies, but how do we create that baseline civic capacity?
For sure. I mean, this is the basis of, you're talking about what the moral consensus ought to be, and that's exactly what we need to reestablish in this country. Now, here's basically how I think about it and how I would look at it. The essence of citizenship, the essence of understanding your own citizenship is understanding your own necessity. The best way to have people not have a sense of their civic importance is to indeed be superfluous in our society. Now, that's a kind of a 30,000-foot concept, so let me make it a little bit more specific. Something happened when you and I were kids. I'm older than you, so maybe it was before you were born. I'm not so sure. Around the time of the Great Society or the War on Poverty, which was a beautifully articulated set of objectives. If you go back and read the May 22nd, 1964 speech, which is the kickoff of the Great Society speech, it was written by Doris Kearns Goodwin's husband. And it's a beautiful speech. It's everything that I think. But something happened around that time in poverty policy and education policy that I think every single one of you and I should regret. And that was, as a nation, we stopped seeing poor people as assets to develop. And we started seeing poor people as liabilities to manage. Now, why is it? We can have partisan discussions and policy arguments and bitter disputes about why that is, but let's all recognize that when you have a left wing that's talking about how we execute welfare and a right wing that's talking about how we execute, sometimes literally, criminal justice policy, those are liability management policies. And that is to say that the people at the bottom are liabilities to manage as efficiently as we possibly can. And that is to say they're superfluous. They're not necessary. They're not needed. And they're not citizens in the moral sense. They're extraneous in the moral sense. If they're look, what does it say on the base of the Statue of Liberty? Give me your huddled masses. Do we mean it? What my great-grandparents, were they, do we mean it anymore? Huddled masses, not so sure. And I'm not just in the context of taking Syrian refugees today. We're talking about the people who are still huddled here. Is that the basis of building a great society? Are these the building blocks of a great nation? Or let's just kind of crowd them into public housing, give them food stamps, say making them work is more expensive than it's worth, and saying, oh, it's too bad for them, and I sure hope they don't commit crimes. It's kind of where we are in America today. So we need, as a matter of civic culture and citizenship, I will propose this to you as we run out of time, a way to not get a policy revolution, but to get a moral revolution. That's 95% of the way. Policy, and I say this with a little bit of regret because I'm the president of a policy think tank, is at the 5% extrinsic margin of progress. 95% is the moral revolution that looks in the eyes of each person and says, you know who that person is? That's me. It's because all I am is riffraff, just like anybody else in this country. And that was the basis upon which the American experiment was developed. This is a nation of great riffraff. And until we can look at our brothers and sisters in the eyes and say, you're me, I'm you, you're the future of this great country, we're going to keep going in the wrong direction.
Arthur Brooks, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Arthur Brooks, American Enterprise Institute.